Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Today, I'm thrilled to have back on the show Paul McGee as our guest. Paul's a renowned speaker from the UK, known for his expertise in change, workplace relationships, and motivation. He has captivated audiences in over 1,000 organizations across 40 countries and is also a best-selling author of influential leadership books such as SUMO, Shut Up and Move On. We'll dive into his latest edition of How to Succeed with People, a personal favorite of mine. And in our conversation, we're going to explore key aspects of a person's background that are crucial for building strong relationships, the challenges of SADS, the self-awareness deficiency syndrome among leaders, and practical solutions to address it, and effective ways to discuss change in a way that encourages people to listen and embrace it. Stay tuned throughout this episode for insights that could transform your approach to leadership and to your relationships. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
Greetings from and this is something I rarely say, greetings from a sunny UK. The northwest of England has sunshine.
So let's go into the book. And the first part of the book, which I think is so apropos, is that if you want to succeed with people, you got to know their background. And their background you have in 5 different parts, because their background affects who they are, and it helps you to understand them, have more empathy toward their perspective, and really deal better with them. So perhaps you can go through each one and maybe identify the one that is perhaps the most important.
Yeah, I mean, that actual chapter is called The Mystery of History. And I think we just need to understand everyone does bring a history and a past. One of the most successful sports managers, coaches in the UK, maybe or may not be known in the US, but he was at one stage managed David Beckham. And that's a guy called Sir Alex Ferguson. And I came across the fact that when he was trying to buy a player and spend millions on them, he wasn't just thinking about their performance on the pitch, but what was their, in a sense, their history and their background off the pitch. So that's what inspired that chapter. And I mean, what it just makes me realize, if you think about age, so I was born in 1964, so BC, before computers. And so in other words, I was born within 20 years of the Second World War finishing. And I'm in the workplace now with people who are, Gen Zs, millennials, and just the world I grew up in. I'm a digital migrant. I didn't grow up with technology. And so even just thinking about somebody's age and background and therefore their experience of life can influence maybe how they behave. And one of the things I'm keen to stress in that chapter is if you understand more about people's past, it can help you understand their present. And so age and background and upbringing, how people were brought up. Some people were brought up to be very confident, to take risks. Other people were very controlled by their parents, and children should be seen and not heard and be ultra polite, but don't speak unless you're spoken to. Little kind of subliminal messages can actually impact how people are. And I think certainly in terms of how people have been managed in the past. So I know some people who were very much micromanaged, and now they've moved to a different company or they have a new boss, and this new boss wants to empower them and give them more responsibility. But actually for some staff, it's like, I'm freaking out. I'm used to the command and control way of being led. And so just understanding, well, what was it like in your previous role? How were you managed? That itself gives you an insight as to why they behave the way they do. And of course, the pandemic, I mean, it was the great reset. It was the great press pause. But again, it's kind of impacted, I think, how now people behave and their expectations of what they want from their jobs. In the UK, I think it happens in the US, we're having to almost like plead with staff, come into the office. That place you used to be in 5 days a week before March 2020? Well, could we have you back for 2? And I get managers now say to me, leaders, I feel like my staff feel they're doing me a favor by saying, oh, okay, I can fit you in on Thursday. I can come in Thursday afternoon, but can only do it once a month. So there's a whole plethora of things, like you say, their previous work culture, the pandemic, their upbringing, their age, their previous experiences. All of that is worth being more mindful of. And that's why it's crucial, I think, get to know your people.
And everyone has a history, and that backstory and history could be vastly different from yours. But an important point to make, which I think you also make in the book, is that a person's past is no excuse for inappropriate or unacceptable behavior in the present, but it does provide clues as to why they behave the way they do.
The work culture, I entered the workplace in the 1980s. That is a vastly different work culture to where we are now. And you would have seen perhaps men particularly behave in a certain way, use certain language, have an attitude towards perhaps a female colleague that would have been very acceptable at that time. But you are dead right. And that's why I stress it in the book. Just because someone might have that as their kind of like their past does not excuse their behavior now. We have evolved, we are evolving, we're improving, we're becoming more enlightened and aware. And I think it's no excuse when someone says, well, it wasn't like that in my day, or that's just a bit of harmless banter. For me, as a guy who's approaching my 60th birthday, I need to be more mindful and more aware and take responsibility for my actions and my attitudes. Even though those actions and attitudes have been shaped by my past, they're not, as you rightly say, an excuse for how I behave now in my present.
So we need to spend more time being curious about people, less time judging them. But there are certain numbers of people, and I've encountered them, and I'm sure you have as well, that you work with someone who seems to possess a similar set of social skills to like a Genghis Khan you mentioned, and who seems completely oblivious to that fact, who finishes off your sentences even if they finish them off incorrectly, or has that annoying habit of talking over people during team meetings. And you have a great acronym, SADS, SADS, and that's what they really suffer from, the self-awareness deficiency syndrome.
I think it was Socrates who said an unexamined life is not a life worth living. And some people are just operating in blissful ignorance about how they are, how they behave, and their impact on other people. And I say, yeah, you're suffering from sad self awareness deficiency syndrome. And there is, I think, for every leader, and I think the fact that there'll be people watching this and listening to it is actually a really encouraging sign. Because what is the antidote to SADS? It is to expose yourself to new learnings, to new insights, to new perspectives. And one of the things that I do in my work is I say to people, now I do make them laugh and hopefully I can be inspirational, but I am actually holding up a mirror to people. A phrase I came across today when on a briefing call with a client, she said, Paul, you know what you do? You provoke reflection. And I do, and I provoke reflection by talking about sometimes my, lack of self-awareness. I mean, here we are. I wrote this book, How to Succeed with People. Charles, do you know what my wife said to me recently? You should read that sometime, Paul. You might pick up an idea or two. I'm like, thanks for the feedback, Helen. But we all need it ourselves, even the authors, even the speakers. One of the things that I think is really important this is how I think is, if you're perceived as an expert, and I'm now a visiting professor at the University of Chester in the northwest of England, people can put you on a pedestal. And a phrase which we were saying before we started the podcast, Paul, stay hungry, stay humble. There's always things to learn. And sometimes your expertise can become a straitjacket to you. You can have your blind spots. And that's why, and in fact, and this is an American character, rather than dedicate the book to anybody, I actually put a quote from Ted Lasso, the Ted Lasso series. See, it was on one of the platforms, I can't remember which one. Be curious, not judgmental. And I think there are some people who lack that sense of curiosity to understand themselves or other people. So it's a real key thing, that I think a whole area of self-awareness.
And rarely do we see ourselves as others see us. So, as you mentioned, When was the last time you asked someone close to you to give you their perspective of how you came across to them and to others, which is so essential? Even ask other people in your life to come up with 10 words that describe you. We could all spend more time on that reflection and making sure that our perception of what we think is coming across is what, in fact, is coming across to others, because many times it's not, and we just don't realize it.
And it does, let's be honest, Charles, it takes a bit of courage to do that because actually, of course, how you might be coming across to people is very positive and very affirming and engaging, in which case part of what you're getting as feedback is encouragement, which we all need. But of course, someone might say, which could definitely happen in my case, Paul, I think you dominated the meeting a little bit too much there, or your passion ran away with you and you didn't actively listen as much as you could have done or ask questions. Not always easy feedback to hear, but it is helpful feedback.
Another thing that I see a lot of in life, and this is not just in a professional setting, but personal settings as well, is that we get what we tolerate in life. So I think that's an important point. It's common sense, but it's not common practice. And I think more leaders should look at this and say, what am I tolerating in my life? Because that behavior is going to continue.
100%. When people tend to talk to me about a problem they might have with an employee, a member of their team, and then I say, well, what have you done so far? And they go, I've not done anything yet. And I go, well, in some ways you have, haven't you? Because, and a phrase they use in the book, your silence, your denial, your avoidance gives approval to the situation. If an employee isn't getting any feedback, they assume no news is good news, perhaps. And that if it was an issue to you, you would have said something. And I sometimes I will say to my wife who works in my business, there are certain things with certain people we do tolerate because it's the bigger picture and we don't want to make an issue out of everything. But I sometimes say to myself, I'm tolerating this, but I'm tolerating it intentionally and on purpose, not as a pure default. Most people don't like conflict, but one of the main reasons why they don't like conflict is they haven't got a flipping clue on how to go about it in the first place, which I know IMS will, and the Good Leadership podcast will have plenty of people who are skilled experts in that area to enable people and equip people to know how to do that more effectively.
Let's move into this change piece because there's a lot of talk around how do you get people to succeed with change. And there's 5 reasons you give for resistance. Talk to me a little bit more about those, Paul, and what you've seen kind of from your experience of those main resistors to change.
Sure. One thing I must say is we need to smash the myth that people don't like change. We like change when it's our choice. We're in control. We see the benefit of doing it or the consequences of not doing it. So we need to be careful that we don't just say people just don't like change. They can do. But as you rightly say, 5 reasons I identified, there would be more. I think we need to just understand that, the part of Daniel Kahneman wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talks about our fast brain and our slow brain. And our fast brain is our primitive, emotional, ancient brain. And its primary purpose is to keep us alive. When you say to someone, there's going to be some change, and that might be followed by a period of uncertainty, we're not being rational and logical and reflexive about this. We're going, what does that mean to my future? Will I still have a job? What will my job title be? Who am I going to work with? Will I need to move and relocate? And they're almost like survival questions. And you can go into the fight or flight or freeze, fight or flight response because we never evolved as a species to do well with uncertainty and the unknown. And sometimes what change obviously can bring is uncertainty and the unknown. The loss of status, again, an interesting one, because I'm interested in how we evolved as Homo sapiens. And what I realize is that the people that survived on the African savannah were the kind of particularly the ones that had high status because they had access to food and to a partner to help keep the species going. And you realize that status, again, is linked to survival. Now, for some people, let's say you've done brilliantly in your job, you're a manager, and you kind of know the systems and procedures inside out in your business. So you feel good. Even whatever your job title was, you feel good because you're in the know. And then there's change and you're not in the know. And maybe there's a reconfiguration of your department and a restructure, and you're no longer VP of something, or you're no longer the manager of. That isn't easy for our ego. So that again, it's understandable. I don't, if someone's demoted, I don't expect them to walk into work the next day singing and dancing. It's a real, genuine human need that people have to have some degree of status. And the others, a loss of control. I remember working with Stephen Covey a few years ago, and then he talks about in his first habit in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about being proactive. And he says he uses this model of your circle of concern and your circle of influence or control. Your circle of concern is what you can't control. But a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about and worrying about and moaning about stuff they can't do anything about. But then he said, you've got that circle of influence. And he was saying to me, people thrive when they've got this sense of self-efficacy, when they feel they've got some kind of control and influence. Now, of course, sometimes change occurs and that control is removed. And I don't know what it's like in the States, but if I ever go round, I don't know, a stately home, and you might, or a museum, and you see this sign and it says, do not touch. There is an inner rebel within me that is suddenly stirred, because up until that point, I wasn't thinking of touching the exhibit. But because I've now been told, do not touch, I kind of want to kind of sneakily touch it. But it does come back to this thing of, if you've ever had a toddler in your world, most toddlers, the word compliant and toddler don't go hand in hand. So when we feel out of control, that's a big issue as well. And then poor relationships. If you don't get on with the person who's implementing the change, you're resistant. And then if you've gone through change before and the company said it's going to improve efficiency, you're going, that's going to lead to redundancies. My job's under threat. So if you've had a negative experience of change before, I think it's very understandable that you are on your guard when change happens now.
Well, and you're right. We have to change our mindset on change because change is not bad. But like you state in the book, don't expect people to get any buy in before they understood the why in, which I love that statement for them to think of change differently and have more control over it.
I mean, it's a phrase which I used in another book as well, and I'm glad you like it. Because sometimes we implement change, but people don't understand, well, why? And I think sometimes it's actually saying to people, here's the consequences if we don't do this. I always say in my seminars and in my keynotes, the scariest place to be is in an organization that's not changing. And you're part of a business, Charles, where you've evolved and you've adapted. But the scariest place is to be in an organization that's not changing. You don't want to be a Blockbuster. You want to be a Netflix. And so we sometimes have to tell people reality rules. We're very comfortable. It's very nice how we're doing things now. But if we want to sustain our success, then we can't rely on how we've done things previously. And it's getting people just to understand, okay, yeah, I need to understand why we're doing this, not just it's happening. And I don't think enough leaders explain that well enough, or say to people, by the way, we could make this really comfortable for you and not change at all and not invest in new technology and not embrace AI. And you would feel really good for the next 3 months. But then you're out of work. And we don't want that for anybody. So that's why we're making these brave decisions now, because we want to have a future and we want to embrace change, not be swallowed up by it and become a victim of it.
When we have those conversations around change, a lot of them are tough conversations. And you have some great strategies to make that communication seem less like a personal attack and soften the blow of having those conversations. And the first strategy you say is when you disagree with a person, you could ask, "Do you mind if I play devil's advocate for a minute?" That way, you're introducing another character into the conversation. You're actually gaining another person's permission to challenge their ideas. not by doing so as yourself, but as the role of a devil's advocate.
There's no way I came up with that as an original thought there, Charles. I've come across it clearly in my reading and my listening. When it's one on one, it can feel a bit confrontational. And then when you almost like this imaginary figure, okay, just imagine someone said this. And all of a sudden, it's almost like you're kind of like, what would you say to them? And it's just a way of getting people to think, but without threatening them and making them defensive. Because you're not saying, I disagree, I think you're wrong. You bring in this, like you say, this third character or this other character, and it diffuses the conflict, because it's not about you and me, it's about them. And what would you say to the person who has this perspective or said that? And there are a lot of ideas I talk about, and I think some of them are good. I think that one's brilliant. I really do, because I've seen it in a number of different situations, and almost in every situation, it does begin to diffuse things. The thing is, sometimes people listen to defend rather than listen to understand. When you're working with people, your goal is to not make them feel defensive, because they ain't going to listen to you. Bringing in the devil's advocate is a very powerful way of actually reducing the amount of conflict in your conversation.
Another two great strategies I like to go over because they're really great strategies that it's going to benefit everyone. The second one is, remember, people find it easier, not easy, but easier and less painful to hear negative news from their mouth than from someone else's. So rather than telling people directly what you thought, simply ask, what have you learned from this experience? And maybe following it by, if you had a chance to do that again, would you do it differently?
I exactly, and I again, it's simple when when you say it. It's like, why is that not taught in every management school on the planet? Because we come back to this Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, our fast brain. I talk about, when I explain his work, I use a red baseball cap and a blue baseball cap. Red cap is our fast brain, and it's fast, automatic, instinctive. It reacts, and it's all about our freeze, fight, or flight. It's all about survival. And so when you're getting some criticism, which no one particularly likes, because it's not a physical threat criticism, but it's a psychological threat. No one wants to look stupid. No one wants to feel humiliated or rejected. So when you say something to someone and the words come from your mouth, people are far more likely to be listening to defend. But when, as you say, ask them, well, how did you think that went? What were your thoughts? So I made a business decision a few years ago, and I would say I made some poor choices and I managed people not as effectively as I could have done. I'm owning that. Do you know what? I'm always keen to let people know that before they've had a chance to say it themselves. I say, I'm going to own this. And I realize, because I'm the first to say that didn't go so well, I was a bit weak. I got what I tolerated. I was a bit of a people pleaser. Because I'm saying it about me, I find that far, far easier to receive than if someone said to me, you know what your problem is, Paul? You've been a people pleaser. You get what you tolerated, and you've avoided conflict. I could have gone, well, that's easy for you. But because the words come from me, I own it far more.
Absolutely. The other strategy that I find hugely helpful in addressing challenging and awkward situations is allowing the other person to save face. Because I think that's so important. By a leader that really cares, that has a high character qualities, is that you want to not humiliate anyone ever. So if you could ask them a question, if you were me, what would you do?
I worked in Asia. The first time I worked in Asia was back in 1997. And I spoke to some people. And the first event I did, I think, was in Hong Kong. And there was this very much, people said, you got to be careful that in the Asian culture, very much about wanting to save face. But do you know what, Charles? I've spoken to over 40 countries. I've spoken a lot in the US, around Europe, Africa, Australia. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's a Asian thing. I think that's a human thing. And again, when you say to people, if you were me, what would you do? Oh, it's the simplicity of the flipping question. It really is. that is so powerful. You don't even, don't buy the book. Just have a couple of these key phrases. It'll make a difference. I mean, you can buy the book as well, but I think we sometimes are looking for complexity and something that will really intellectually challenge us, and that's the only way to really break through in our relationships. And then all of a sudden you come across some of the insights we're talking about, and you kind of almost like the scales come off your eyes and go, oh yeah, humiliation is for amateurs. We need to be skilled in how we deal with people. And you're right, those 3 strategies are really effective.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.